So Baub, Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze here to deliver a lead lecture today on the theories of cross-curricular pedagogies that will underpin a lot of the work that we've been doing so far on the programme on cross-curricular curriculum design. And of course, this sits within the wider context of the curriculum for Wales, which we know is a design that combines subject disciplines within areas of learning and experience. Tom and I have got some history of research and expertise in this area. We've tried to investigate it from the perspective of our own subject disciplines and within our own AoLE, the Expressive Arts. We're here to tell you the fruits of those research findings that we've explored, but we're also here to give you some food for thought for your own practice and to prompt you to reflect on what you've seen so far in school. Now, of course, up to this point, you've had a little bit of experience doing some cross-curricular curriculum design on our cross-phase day, working with peers from the alternative age phase, combining two AoLEs and looking at the challenges and the opportunities when working in that way. So we're going to give you some theory now to underpin that work and to give you some more to chew on and think about in this lead lecture. Our key aims are to introduce you to some key theories of cross-curricular pedagogies that we've discovered and also that we have co-constructed ourselves with regard to the expressive arts area of learning and experience, to provide some really concrete, clear examples of what cross-curricular pedagogies look like in practice in the classroom, and finally, and this will happen throughout the lead lecture, to stimulate critical reflection on your part and to hopefully influence your practice going forward. So where does this fit into your journey and the broader aim for you to make a progress and to achieve in the professional standards for teaching and leadership? Well, there are two descriptors that we think are really key here. The first being in the pedagogy cluster of standards, exploiting subject disciplines and areas of learning. Now, what this particular standard descriptor is asking you to do is to not only understand the pedagogies that are necessary to and pertinent to individual disciplines, but also understand cross-curricular pedagogies when you're ranging across disciplines within AoLE and across AoLEs. It's also speaking to Professional Learning 1, where you are asked to consider wider research and reading in order to influence what's going on in your practice. So that kind of theory into practice is hopefully what you're going to gain through this lead lecture and as you go forth from this lead lecture. So two important links there to the professional standards of teaching and leadership.
So just to recap, the why we find ourselves here doing this sort of cross-curricular working. And it's to do with a range of international curriculum trends. It's really important, as I think probably Emma mentioned in her lecture way back on day one of the programme, it's important to understand that this curriculum hasn't been put together just in a vacuum in isolation. This is not just Wales. There are a number of important pieces of writing from the past few years which have suggested the need to move curriculum on to be fit for the 21st century. And the way that things move so fast now in the 21st century and the way that people find themselves doing jobs, for example, that probably didn't exist when they were at school, means that it's now very difficult to really define content that needs to be in a curriculum, even to define skills. And it also means that we need to stop working in silos in our subject disciplines and to make those connections, transfer the knowledge and understanding across the different contexts, drop those artificial barriers between the subject disciplines in order that our learners have the capacities to help them address problems which are not familiar to them and which we may not even know about when we're designing the curriculum that they're going to be working from in school. And so we find ourselves needing to make these connections across those subject boundaries. Now, Donaldson, in his report from 2015, is very clear that this is something that needs to happen in a 21st century school in Wales. But he strikes a cautionary note in his report. He says artificial connections between those subject disciplines would render the exercise meaningless. And certainly Emma and I are going to talk about experiences we've had where we've really backed that up. He says that if powerful connections within and between areas of learning and experience, within and between subject disciplines and groups of subject disciplines. If they can be found, then they're likely to improve and reinforce learning in the constituent disciplines. So it's important to bear in mind what he's saying there is just making connections doesn't mean that the learning experiences are going to be good. They have to be the right kind of connections, they have to be high quality connections, and the learning has to be good. And Donaldson says that these approaches, which allow connections to be made via common questions, common concepts, common skills, should be explored within those groups of subject disciplines, within those areas of learning and experience, but also across them. So he really opens up the possibilities there, but it's down to us as potential curriculum designers and as teachers of the future to work out how we can do that in a high quality way. So, time to have a little think. I'm not going to ask you to respond to this now. I'm just going to ask you a really big question. I'm pulling out that artificial versus powerful thing that Donaldson talks about in his quote. What do you, at this point in your PGCE, in your journey into the teaching profession, what do you think he means? What do you think artificial connections and powerful connections could look like in your own disciplinary comfort zone, perhaps in your own specialist subject or your own subject that you know well, and something else that you know quite well? And what could be the dangers if we settle for those artificial connections between subject disciplines? What could potentially go wrong? So I'm going to leave that with you. Feel free to put something in the chat if you want to, but we're not going to kind of pause and take those from you now, but just think about that question and what you think it might mean to you.
Now, of course, there are eminent researchers in this field who've gone before us, who've already done some very good work, research, thinking, theorising around cross-curricular pedagogies. And Fortley and Savage are two such researchers. We think this quote is really crucial as a kind of framing quote to any work that we embark on, which attempts to bring more than one discipline together in a meaningful way to create powerful connections. Fortley and Savage talk about cross-curricular approaches as a means of synthesising ideas between subject disciplines. But they hit a note of caution here, which is really important. They say that this should not be done in a way that destroys the cherished ideas and ways of thinking that each and every subject contains. Now, as a disciplinary specialist, this really resonates with me. I am from a secondary background, I am a drama specialist, and there are cherished ideas, concepts, knowledge, skills that I would certainly want any pupil at any phase in their education to encounter, to learn about, to know, to have experienced, to be able to do if they're learning about drama. And my worry, if we're combining subjects, is that potentially some of those really important cherished ideas that I cling to that are really clearly defined in my subject domain, that they might be lost when we attempt to combine subjects. So this really resonated with me, this particular quote. Now, of course, I am a secondary phase practitioner. Primary phase practitioners, this may resonate with you, but you might be a bit more comfortable about this process. So wherever you fit or however you respond to that quotation, hopefully we're going to unpack it a little bit more as we go through this lead lecture. So in order for us to use cross-curricular pedagogies in order to bring the subject disciplines together in a meaningful way, we first and foremost need to make sure that the curriculum is organised in such a way that brings the disciplines in close proximity to one another. So we can turn to the work of Drake and Burns here, who give us three categories of cross-curricular curriculum design. The first being multidisciplinary. As you can see from the diagram, this is where we've got a common theme, which individual subject disciplines respond to, but very much in a discrete disciplinary way. So the focus is on the disciplines, but using themes as a connection between them. Now, if we've been critical here, we might say that this is all very well and good, but unless we encourage the pupils to make connections across those disciplines when working towards that theme, then they're not necessarily going to be able to make those powerful connections. So multidisciplinary is our first category. Secondly, we've got interdisciplinary, and we can see from the Venn diagram here that we potentially have got more fertile ground for the individual disciplines to integrate. So this is where we organise the curriculum around learning aspects in common within the disciplines, thereby emphasising interdisciplinary skills between the subjects. So there's an open-hand invitation for this to work, for practitioners to come together to look for those interdisciplinary skills, to look for the learning aspects in common in order for the pupils to be able to make those powerful connections between disciplines. And then finally, we've got an approach called transdisciplinary, which foundation phase practitioners might recognise as being very familiar to the pupil-led approach to curriculum that they do. This is where the pupils ask questions around a topic, and that dictates the direction into disciplines that the curriculum takes. So the teachers build the curriculum around the pupils' questions, for example, exploring a topic through a project so that the disciplines are subsidiary to the topic. So let's say, for instance, the topic was dinosaurs. The pupils' inquiry questions around that topic will lead the curriculum into individual disciplinary territory. But again, there potentially not necessarily as much opportunity for the disciplines to combine. So 3 interesting categories there of cross-curricular curriculum design.
So, having taken a look at those curriculum concepts there, let's have a look and see what the Curriculum for Wales did as it evolved towards the final document that we're using now, because it did go through a draft phase. They published a draft and then consulted on it and then published the final one. So we're looking here at the Expressive Arts curriculum document, specifically for the Expressive Arts AoLE. And you can see here that we've got some information about how we could potentially organise our curriculum. And we can see 1 or 2 familiar words in there, interdisciplinary approach, and now of course we've got some idea what some of those mean. However, there was a bit of a bombshell hidden away in the documentation, which is this section here, which seems to suggest that the subject disciplines could be delivered by a single practitioner. Now, primary specialists might turn around and tell us that, yeah, absolutely, they do that all the time. But for secondary subject specialist expressive arts practitioners, music specialists, drama specialists, and so on, this was really quite inflammatory, this idea that our subjects could all be delivered by a single person. And I would imagine that there would have been a number of expressive arts subject specialists across Wales who were quite uncomfortable with this idea. And it was really interesting to see that by the time the final document came through, there was a considerably bigger section on the role of disciplines. The role of disciplines had been talked up in this final section. That slightly worrying section had disappeared, and in fact it had been replaced by a section which specifically talked about the need for pupils to have opportunities to specialise within the subject disciplines as they got older, as they progressed through their learning. And it contained this very, very important sentence: this will require specialists to teach and specialists to design. And it's really notable that from the kind of early, perhaps idealistic version of the curriculum document, which suggested that these subject disciplines were going to join together seamlessly with no problems at all, perhaps a little bit of reality had started to set in by the time the final version was published. And certainly you'll find later on in the lecture, this does chime with some of the work that Emma and I did, and we found ourselves kind of on a similar journey. So it's interesting to see that that is the evolution of those curriculum documents from draft to final.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground there. We need to take a moment to reflect, to pause for thought. So what we want you to do is just to take a moment to think, as subject experts, what your opinions are on the notion of cross-curricular pedagogy and cross-curricular curriculum design at this stage. And what are you seeing and hearing on the ground? Perhaps you've had some experience teaching in this way already. Perhaps this notion of powerful connections and artificial connections is on your radar and you've got something to say about that. Take the time to just think, formulate some thoughts. Perhaps you've got some questions, pop them in the Q&A.
So Paula Webber, who has been something of an insider on the Curriculum for Wales journey, has been listening into this on the lecture. Paula, what are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Thank you, Tom. This is really interesting, lecture for me to listen into and be part of. First of all, I want to say how brilliant it is to see R&E in practice. Your research informing practice and how important that is. But in terms of disciplinary and interdisciplinary, I could see that journey that we were taking when we were writing the new curriculum, where we sort of arrived in the room. I was part of the humanities AoLE, all subject experts fighting our corner for our subject, without clearly being able to see the links and connections between the subjects. And when we came from there, we could do that much more easily, and it was interesting that we were teachers of. I was a teacher of RE at the time, it's now RVE, they were historians, geographers and business studies people, but by the time we came from there, we identified as humanities with it, but also with that subject specialism, which is absolutely important, because how can you see the concepts and the key ideas if you don't have that disciplinary lens? If you're not wearing the glasses, how can you actually see that? So subject disciplinary specialism is vital, I think, in this new curriculum. But I love, all of this work that you've done in your research. So I don't know if there are any questions coming in yet from the Q&A.
I think people are a bit quiet at the moment. We've given them a lot to think about there. So I think it would be useful just to kind of probe. Oh, actually, just as I spoke, we've got one anonymous contribution coming in here. So this person is saying, out of curiosity, did not the writers of the draft realise such a suggestion of merging all expressive arts into one class under one teacher should cause such controversy? I don't understand how they wouldn't have seen that it would be viewed as problematic by teaching staff within the profession. Surely they considered and spoke with staff before issuing the first draft. Paula, you can probably contribute on this, having been involved with the pioneers, and I likewise with the expressive arts, but I'd love to hear your thoughts first.
Yes, I of course they spoke with subject specialists, because they, we were all subject specialists writing the curriculum. But what is really interesting about this Welsh curriculum is that we all have ownership of it. So drafts were seen in their raw form. They were never intended to be the final version. The reason they were released was to get public feedback and then to act on that. So and I know that caused some controversy. I started to see, for example, job adverts for humanities teachers and not specifically for subject teachers. So I think we were all there flying the flag and saying disciplines matter. And if you look at the descriptions for learning and the progression steps, it is clear that progression steps in those disciplines are really important as they progress through, their journey from 3 to 16. Look at progression step 5, and I don't know how a non-specialist is able to deliver that, and there definitely needs to be specialism in the designing of that curriculum from the outset. As I say, if you don't have the glasses on, you can't see where you're going with it.
Thanks, Paula. We've got some more questions coming through and comments here from students out there. Is there a risk that too much focus on cross-disciplinary teaching, removing the high-quality learning opportunity for pupils to make their own connections between different subjects or topics? What are your thoughts on that, Paula?
I think learners will make connections, and I think in one way that's the whole point, because they weren't making connections between the subject disciplines. So if I could give you an example of that, I remember being teaching in a secondary school, and I taught 2 lessons in a row. One was English and the other one was RE, and they couldn't transfer their skills and their knowledge between those subjects despite having the same teacher in the same room, because the planning hadn't been done with this sort of interdisciplinary approach in mind. And even if schools are organising their timetables around disciplinary models, say in secondary schools, the planning will develop some of those links. And if you're looking at concepts, which I know we're going to be looking at later in more detail, if you were planning around common concepts between the disciplines, then the learners will definitely begin to make the connections themselves as they progress through the progression steps.
Thank you very much, Paula. We've got a question here that's very specific to language, literacy and communication, science and technology, and the other AoLEs. And it's, have we seen the same suggestions in LSE and S&T? And the answer is yes. At that draft phase, I think we had the same concerns coming through and proposals. And I think this is perhaps how a common myth or misconception about curriculum for Wales has taken hold in some schools out there, and we know this from working with a number of schools across Wales, that there is this myth and misconception that an interdisciplinary approach is all that's required, and particularly we know that secondary practitioners are very concerned about that, as I think we talked about. But I think what we would recommend, and certainly we've recommended this as part of our cross-phase work, is that you look into your specific AoLEs, particularly looking at the designing your curriculum aspect of the curriculum on Hub, and you will notice in there what is being advised with regard to designing a localised response to the curriculum, and how schools can be working in clusters, and where they can be coming together with some ideas about key concepts within their field before coming to look at how they respond in a very localised way with their own curriculum plans in schools. So I think it's really important, like something that we did, and hopefully you could see that in the first part of our video lead lecture there, was we really tried to look at the detail. Really, you can't neglect the detail in what we've got on Hub, and getting down into that detail is really going to give you a sense of how we should be responding to this on the ground. And as Paula put it, kind of seeing through that lens as well, seeing through the lens of knowledge that you'll get from looking very closely at those curriculum documents that we've got on Hub. Paula, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yes, I think it's so important to start with your own subject in the planning, you know, middle leaders now, in secondary particularly, but also primary, you know, looking at through the lenses of those different subjects. Before you make the links, you need to understand your own subjects first and work, you know, with that, and then see where the links come naturally, authentically. You know, when we looked at numeracy for, you know, a couple of decades ago, we all had to teach it. It was, you know, there was some really poor work being done. So I saw, for example, people colouring prayer mats in RVE because they were symmetrical, and talking about symmetry, you know, and you can do that, but you're shoehorning numeracy into something. The links have to be authentic, meaningful and purposeful when they are planned for.
Thanks, Paula. Now, the final thing I'd like to add here, just before we move on to the next video segment, is that, of course, we are all teachers and responsible for cross-curricular skills. So everything that we're talking about here, about the potential dilution of subject, technically could also apply to the potential dilution or tokenistic approaches to attempting to teach and integrate the cross-curricular skills into our lessons. And as Paula mentioned there, I've seen similar things in drama, whereby drama practitioners, not just teacher trainees in initial teacher education, but also practitioners in the field who have tried to shoehorn in numeracy, diluted it, breeded more misconceptions. So, it really is about us collaborating with, we're seeing numeracy coordinators, literacy coordinators. We interviewed one from Stanwell on the podcast who talked to us a lot about how we can integrate numeracy in a way that doesn't dilute those numeracy skills or breed misconceptions. So something to remember as we go into the next segment. So handing back over now to our next segment of video footage for you to consider, but of course continue to add to the Q&A as and when you feel it appropriate. Thank you.
So noting Donaldson's call for teachers to try to facilitate, through cross-curricular pedagogies, powerful connections between disciplines, Tom and I felt that it was incumbent on us to do some of our own research in this area within the domain of the expressive arts. So we looked to literature. We did a systematic literature review investigating whether other expressive arts practitioners had brought together the disciplines through cross-curricular pedagogies. We were looking to see if there were any trends in the literature and if we could identify any particular categories of cross-curricular pedagogies that were facilitating powerful connections. And in fact, we did notice a trend. We noticed that categories of different types of cross-curricular pedagogy emerged, and from that we could identify a hierarchy of cross-curricular pedagogies where connections between disciplines were ranging from very tenuous artificial connections to what Donaldson would call more powerful, meaningful connections between disciplines.
So here in a nutshell is what we actually did. Looking through our articles which described cross-curricular pedagogies in the expressive arts, we tried to see where there were similarities between the approaches, and we tried to give them a classification. And you can see here the columns, each of those in an article that we read. And some of those columns have got quite a lot of boxes in them because those articles ranged across lots of different ways of doing cross-curricular pedagogies. As you can see, the one on the end there on the right only has one. But these were things that they named in the articles, and those boxes are the names that they chose for them. And it very quickly became clear to us that there were some similarities. So you can see now the colours have appeared on the boxes. So basically all those yellow ones, they've all got different names, but as far as we were concerned, they were basically the same thing. Similarly with the pink, the green, and so on. And this was where we started to see the connections between the articles. Once we'd noticed those similarities between the different ways of doing things, we were able to put them together like this, and we found that there were 4 different types. At the moment you can see they're just called category 1 to 4, but all of those different names that different authors gave to those methods, as far as we were concerned, they were very, very similar ways of doing things. And so we allowed ourselves to choose names for those. You can see we gave them peripheral, disciplinary proximity, cooperative development, and common concept. And in a minute, we'll be explaining to you in detail what each of those 4 things were. But most importantly, and bearing in mind the aim that we've set out at the start of this lecture, we wanted to show which of these made the powerful connections and which perhaps were the ones that we wanted to avoid. So we put them in a taxonomy, we ranked them, and you can see at the bottom there was the peripheral one. That was the least effective as far as we were concerned. We got one in the middle there, which was kind of okay. Up at the top, we've got those 2, the pink and the green. Now, to be honest, we just couldn't separate those in terms of how effective they were, so we put them in equal place at the top.
So as Tom said, we've got a spectrum here, or a taxonomy, from the least powerful connections, the most artificial connections between disciplines, to the most powerful connections. And this first one is at the bottom of the pyramid. We've got the peripheral taxonomy categorisation, and this is where the arts discipline is used as a vehicle for learning about something else. Now, you may all remember from your own experiences in school, perhaps using music as a vehicle for learning your times tables or other aspects of curriculum content. Now, of course, that might have been a really useful learning aid, but we certainly couldn't say with confidence that you'd learned a lot about music as a discipline there. So here we see that the arts are being used as a motivational technique, more as a vehicle or a conduit for learning in other areas. And therefore, the arts discipline is on the periphery, it's not front and centre. So learning in the arts discipline is therefore not a priority. Now, of course, we're talking about arts disciplines here, we're talking about the expressive arts, but you could, in a different subject discipline, perhaps find some kind of resonance there between your subject discipline being used as a vehicle for another subject discipline. So this is not necessarily discrete to arts disciplines. So an example here, as I've already said, is that pupils learn their times tables by singing them. And the impact here on learning is that pupils make little or no progress in music, in the arts discipline, and the discipline is not seen as valuable for its own sake.
Moving on to number 2, the disciplinary proximity one, which we give the nickname Hit and Hope. And actually this was the one that we actually did when we first did our project. We just put our 2 subjects together and hoped for the best. This is where you do simply that. You put the disciplines together in a space or in time, or they share a topic or stimulus. But you haven't really planned it or thought it through. You're just hoping that the presence of those 2 disciplines together in the same room, or the fact that the one teacher of the discipline knows that the other one's doing the same topic at the same time, is somehow going to clarify or enrich another one. And you know, sometimes it works. The problem with it is you just can't guarantee it that much, and there is a danger that it's not going to work. And really, that's just not good enough as far as we're concerned with our planning. We need to have a better chance of success than hit and hope. So let's take a look at an example. This one is involving drama. So Emma was looking at my subject, now I'm looking at Emma's subject. Here's another really favourite thing to do with drama. Pupils devising a scene which dramatises a historical event. So they're aiming for them to understand a little bit more about history, perhaps to humanise those long ago events for them, get some sort of empathy going, perhaps, through getting them to do some role play, some acting out. There's nothing wrong with that, in the same way as there's nothing wrong with using a song to learn your times tables. You know, it's a great tool and it's great and everything, but you do have to be really honest with yourself about whether both disciplines involved are getting a fair crack of the whip here. And in this case, if you don't plan it carefully, one discipline is going to be an unequal partner. So history is potentially going to gain massively from the use of this great pedagogical strategy, the use of the role play. The problem is that if you don't think as much about the drama, the pupils are going to miss out on really useful opportunities to develop the quality of their drama devising, the quality of their acting skills at the same time. So history is going to be the winner. Drama is going to miss out on an opportunity, and potentially even worse, you're going to believe that you've been developing both subjects when actually you haven't.
And so now we get to the top of the pyramid, and we're going to look at the 2 approaches, classifications of cross-curricular pedagogies within the expressive arts that we found to have much more powerful connections being facilitated between the disciplines. So the first is cooperative development, and this is where pupils actively are encouraged by the teacher to use their skills and knowledge in one discipline to help them understand concepts or overcome obstacles obstacles in another, and vice versa. This is a really interesting approach pedagogically, and it's a much more active engagement between the two subject disciplines. So development in one discipline helps prompt development in the other in an iterative process. And in the examples that we saw in the literature, this was a process that kind of pendulum back and forth between the disciplines, which will be best exemplified on the next slide. So for example, pupils could be investigating in music how the elements of music influence the elements of drama through a combined process of rehearsal and performance. Now, this is actually quite commonplace in the business, in the performing arts industry, where many collaborative practitioners in the field of music and theatre making will work together in tandem because they're working to the same artistic aim. This is quite authentic. But what is really important in this example is that the two disciplines and the outcomes for the elements of music and the outcomes for the elements of drama are both on an even standing in terms of the learning outcomes that you're expecting from the pupils. So they're learning about the elements of music, they're learning about the elements of drama, and by doing so simultaneously, one is impacting the other and helping the pupil to make progress in tandem in both. So we can see an example of this in our own student-teachers practice, where they were co-devising a piece of music that they were composing alongside a piece of physical theatre, which is a drama stylistic approach, doing both at the same time, with one having an impact on the other.
So now we come to our fourth category, which, as you remember, we placed on a par with the third one in terms of how effective it was. We called it common concept, and it has a number of similar features to the other one. Pupils learn about this concept that's shared between more than one discipline. And what's interesting here is, again, they can overcome the difficulties and the misconceptions in one discipline by switching to the other one, by using their understanding of it in the other one and switching back and forth. And it's really important to bear in mind here, of course, that if you have got a pupil working in two disciplines at the same time in this way, some pupils are going to be stronger in one and some are going to be stronger in the other. And you're going to find that the route that the pupil takes and the way that they switch between one and the other, they may not be the same from pupil to pupil. The key is that they can do that so that their strengths in one will help them understand another. So let's look at the example that was used here, and the metaphor that was used was translation. And in this case, we were using drawing, art, and we were using creative writing. And of course, English generally is thought of as belonging within the language, literacy and communication AoLE, but there is a creative side to English, and creative writing has got a nice connection there with the sort of work that we're doing in the expressive arts. And in the example that was cited in the article, pupils had this double page spread in a notebook, and they were using the concept of composition, which also is used in the music discipline, although they weren't involved here. One side of their double page spread, they were writing, and the other side they were drawing, and they were composing. And as I said, some pupils will probably be much more comfortable composing in the art domain, and some will probably be more comfortable composing in the writing domain. But because they were translating from one to the other, if they got stuck, they could switch across to the other side of the page, work in their comfort zone a bit more, make some progress, and then translate that progress back to the domain that they were a little bit less comfortable in. And in that way, they were able to make progress in both. And they were able to use those individual strengths they had to help them improve in the discipline that perhaps they were a little bit less strong in. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of our work, and feel free to come and find us at some point if you want to find a little bit more about it. But let's come all the way back to Curriculum for Wales. Let's come all the way back to the Donaldson report, which kind of set the whole process off. And he said that pedagogical approaches that allow these connections to be made via common questions, concepts, or skills should be explored within and across the areas of learning and experience. And we've kind of shed a bit of light on that with what we've described up to this point. Let's think back to just before Christmas when we were doing our cross-phase day and you were looking at some very, very big picture stuff, but you were also trying to find some ways through the nuts and bolts of those curriculum documents. We were asking you to find common concepts that are shared between the two AoLEs, and perhaps now you can see what we were doing when we were trying to do that. The question I suppose to ask now is, having found those common concepts, if you can remember what they are, have you got any thoughts, or do you have any more clarity, or do you have any more confidence that you could now go the next step and consider how to address those common concepts in ways which avoid the dilution of those all-important subject disciplines which were involved, or which avoid artificial connections made between those subjects? So we're asking you now to place some thoughts in the Q&A so we can see what you think.
So we're going to head to Paula whilst you're thinking about that and putting your thoughts in the Q&A. Paula, from your reflections on that cross-phase working day, what are your responses to this?
Thank you, Emma and Tom. And to be honest, my mind is going all around the place. I've listened to this, these lectures a couple of times, and I suggest, students come back and rewatch this again. I'm already thinking how it's going to influence my practice in the future. I really like your classifications of cooperative development, I'm just thinking from my own subject point of view, for example, how much could be learnt about, unpacking, theology and things like that through a historical lens, and how much we're going to learn and strengthen our own subjects, by having these interdisciplinary approaches, and how much I can learn from historians in order to do that. All around the country now, all around Wales, the consortia are rolling out professional learning, and at the moment they are looking at concepts and how to unpack them from the What Matters statements. And we looked at in the cross-phase day, the concept of belonging and various things like that, and unpacking those concepts that can be seen right across numerous areas of learning and experience in the curriculum, but always through your subject lens, talking with other people, with other practitioners, and planning for these approaches would be great. My one warning, I think, when I'm listening to common concepts and things like that, is always to start with the What Matters statements, and look at where the concepts sit in context, in those statements. And then you're identifying, we did this in the cross-phase day, you're identifying the common concepts from the What Matters statements, and then right throughout your planning, you were bringing them back to those What Matters statements and checking the actual context that was meant to be addressed, I suppose. So don't separate entirely concepts from the statements of What Matters. So I know that we've got loads of questions coming in now, Emma, so I'm going to pass back to you in a minute.
We've got some really interesting contributions. Thank you very much to those of you who have posed some really interesting pause for thought moments here for us to consider. And I think just before we get into them, it's worth saying that we don't have all the answers on this. We're relying on you and school colleagues. We're working together collaboratively to try and make the best attempts at this whole idea of subsidiarity and putting together localized curricula that is going to give our learners the kind of the best education that we can possibly provide. So going to a really interesting point here with regard to my previous point earlier on in the lead lecture about literacy, numeracy and digital competence. This anonymous contributor is saying it's a good point regarding misconceptions, especially in the cross-curriculum skills. Will schools be expected expected, encouraged, required to have some form of quality assurance process to prevent or minimise poor quality or artificial connections. What happens if a maths or IT teacher gets told, oh, we got taught that differently by so and so in another subject in a non-specialist lesson? And I've put in the Q&A, this is a really good point, and I would encourage others to give their thoughts on this. We know, having interviewed Richard West, who's the numeracy coordinator at Stanwell School, that something that he's been very keen to do is to generate some numeracy kind of walkthroughs and tutorials, and he's done a lot of collaborative work with the different departments within the school from a disciplinary perspective to help them look for the opportunities for meaningful coverage of the cross-curriculum skills, but also to produce resources to increase the quality and increase the confidence and the accuracy for teachers who are attempting to do this, and to get that kind of parity of message and to avoid that breeding of misconceptions. But I think on that point, it would be worth speaking to numeracy coordinators, literacy coordinators. We tell you to use your research and inquiry time wisely. This is an interesting line of inquiry to interrogate during clinical practice 2, or if you have time, in the final week of clinical practice 1. Paula, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything on that one.
Yeah, in terms of quality assurance, I suppose that comes on different levels. So you've got your numeracy or literacy or DCF coordinators in school that would provide perhaps professional learning and things like that to teachers, and maybe do audits within the school to check the quality of that. But then you've also got input from consortia as well. So they provide professional learning. They'll go in and work as partners in schools to improve all aspects of the curriculum, not just this. But then obviously I suppose the different way that Estin now is also working in terms of quality assurance. So they will come in and do quality checks every now and again, on all aspects of the curriculum, in order to provide advice on how that school can improve. And then all of that quality assurance is in place, to provide high standards in all aspects of education.
Thanks, Paula. We've got a good point here, and this is a concern that I have heard from secondary practitioners since Successful Futures was published, and it's a concern about the break between pre-16 and post-16 provision. This contributor says, we're effectively asking pupils to move from a cross-curricular approach until the end of GCSEs into a heavy subject-specific discipline at A level, without perhaps enough of the subject-specific background to excel in those disciplines. Pupils find the jump between the levels difficult enough, but without a thorough grounding from a subject discipline at GCSE level, I worry that it will lead to students taking courses that they're just not prepared for. Paula, I know you had some thoughts on this.
Yes, what a fantastic question. Thank you for that. I think, that I was talking about, disciplines needing to be visible within the curriculum. So we haven't lost them, and it's not completely interdisciplinary necessarily. And I know that, certainly Qualifications Wales are doing a lot of work now around redesigning new GCSEs. But they've released sort of the areas that they will be producing GCSEs for, and they are certainly disciplinary. If you look at the progression steps, gradually the disciplines become much more clear as you're progressing through those progression steps. And if you look at progression step 5, I would say that that's really challenging for students, and we are hoping and expecting and giving them the opportunity to perform it, to progress to higher standards, I suppose, than we have before. Just have a look at those progression steps for progression step 5 and the disciplines that come through there. Then you've got your qualifications at GCSE, which will be subject specific qualifications, and then automatically every 10 years examinations are rewritten. So I suspect by the time the learners that are starting in 2022 get to A level, they will have re-looked at A level by then as well. So I'm really not concerned that they will be at the right standard, but it's great, a fantastic question, but a lot of thought has been put into that, you know, by lots of partners, including people writing the curriculum, Qualifications Wales, and, you know, obviously the exam boards will do their job then.
Thanks, Paula. And I think it's another reason for us to ensure that we're not neglecting what Lucy Crehan, who's involved in a project with Consortia, would call middle tier planning. And that is where we're looking at subject disciplines, we're looking at concepts, we're looking at things like what we would call threshold concepts, concepts that when pupils master them, when pupils really acquire an understanding of a threshold concept in your subject, they're starting to show that they can think like a mathematician, think like a historian. So I think it's an open-handed invitation for you to really start to have those conversations in your subject cohorts with your subject mentors about what are those non-negotiable, sorry, that's my timer going off telling me that I need to stop speaking. What are those non-negotiables that I mentioned in the video that you absolutely would expect your young people in your respective subject disciplines by the time they get to age 14, age 16, to have mastered, to have been able to demonstrate, apply, experience and know. I think we've got time for just one final point here, and this is a really good one. It's given that the teachers in this group are science and tech, maths and numeracy and health and wellbeing. Do you have any anecdotes from student teachers from these specialisms who have used these taxonomies and how? That is an excellent point. And the answer at this stage is no, because this is actually quite fresh research, but that is an invitation to you out there in these other AoLEs and in other disciplines to look to see what this taxonomy, whether this taxonomy applies to your particular subject, whether it applies and what those examples might be from a subject specific perspective. What we do have is some really interesting contributions from students on the programme last year who engaged in cross-curricular work across AoLEs between maths and numeracy, science and technology and health and well-being, and having engaged in that project, they talked to us, and we caught this on camera, and we've got it on our YouTube channel, how they perceived of those experiences and what their concerns were about cross-curricular pedagogies having done it. So I'm just going to, in the Q&A, add a link to those videos so that you can have a look at them in your spare time, and we'd love to hear back from you actually. And we know that the next phase in our research is to start to get out into schools and having a look to see if this theory does translate in practice from what we're seeing on the ground. So
can I just come in here
Paula,
and say how fantastic to see that this reflective sort of, you know, these reflective questioning coming in on your research, and how once you start research you can go down a rabbit hole of more and more and more, and it, you know, it sort of triggers the next steps and the next steps. And you know, I'm just you know, really grateful that you've done this, because it's going to go away. I'm going to go away and really think about my own subject and my own thinking with it as well.
Thanks, Paula. Now, I do see that there is a very subject-specific question that has just come in, and it's in the case of science. There will be a double award science, but there will be biology. But will there be biology, chemistry, and physics A levels? Will each of the disciplines within the science GCSE be graded separately? Now, I think this is something to take back to your programme leads and to talk to your subject mentors about, and certainly to have a look at what's going on the WJC website, to have have a look what's going on the Qualifications Wales website, because this is all public, this is all out there, all the new developments are accessible. So that would be my response to that. Now I
think at A level they will be separate sciences, and you know, going forward to prepare them then for university. So I've you know, I'm not 100% sure at all, but from conversations that I've had, I suspect there will be more, you know, more subjects available at A level.
Yes, and I know from a drama perspective that is the idea, that we're not going to lose our individual subject GCSEs, but there will be an alternative, an expressive arts or a performing arts GCSE. So it's worth looking and keeping an eye on what's going on from an exam board perspective, as Paula mentioned earlier on, and with regards to Qualifications Wales and consortia. Yeah. Okay, so I know that our fabulous producer Tom Breeze is standing by to run our last video. Can I just take this opportunity to thank you all for your engagement in this lead lecture. You've given us a lot of food for thought. It's been really sort of thought-provoking, your contributions, and I think even more so because our work comes from the Expressive Arts AoLE, but you're coming at it from other AoLEs, and I think this is a really clear example of why we need to be engaging in these professional dialogues within and across AoLEs. So I'm going to hand over to Tom now, who's going to start our final VT. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground there. We've drawn upon our own research, we've looked at other researchers in this field, but what can you do now to think about combining theory and practice and moving your own practice forward in this vein? Well, it's going to take a bit of time for you to continue to digest, to analyse and to unpick the AoLE curriculum that we've got on Hub, and look in forensic detail, if you can, at the potential fertile ground for combining skills, knowledge, concepts between the individual disciplines and between the AoLEs. And of course, we've got ongoing cross-phase work in this vein for you to practically experiment with that as well. We want you to keep talking and collaborating with one another. So discuss your findings, having looked at those documents, having worked on this at university and having experienced this in different contexts on clinical practice. Talk to your peers about it and your colleagues from opposite disciplines within and across your AoLEs. How are they finding this process? How have they found the connections between disciplines in practice, and what pedagogies are best facilitating those? Really useful thing to do is to observe another subject or subjects within your AoLE. I find this incredibly refreshing, and it can give me a new insight on my own arts pedagogies within the Expressive Arts AoLE. So look specifically at common knowledge, at common skills, at common concepts and how they're being taught in a different discipline. And of course, take the time to reflect. Reflect with your peers, reflect with your mentor and with other colleagues, because there are a lot of different perspectives on this work, and indeed different approaches from school to school. And this will help you, hopefully, to move forward in your own planning and to integrate cross-curricular pedagogies in your future work on clinical practice and when you qualify. So where are there other opportunities on the programme for you to consolidate and to deepen your knowledge in this area? We've got a school-led training day dedicated to investigating powerful connections and how we make those powerful connections between disciplines. So you'll be doing that in your lead partnership or alliance school. You can have a look at some of the research that we've touched upon in this lead lecture and obviously read the respective chapters that it comes from and find your own research in this vein. There's plenty of it out there, particularly in the context of Curriculum for Wales.
And there's a certain inevitability that there are several podcast episodes on this. We milked our research as much as we possibly could. So if you want to find out more, that was a really brief summary of the research that we did. You can go and check out some of the episodes on the podcast, and there are some other ones as well where we talked to our former colleague, Dr. Judith Neen, who's also done some really interesting research into how we make the new Curriculum for Wales work in reality. So that's it from us, and many thanks to Paula for the work that she's done in supporting us in the Q&A and giving us her thoughts, having had the experience of co-designing bits of the new curriculum. Our references are there on the screen. We hope you found this useful, and very good luck to you for your own curriculum journey now.